Hi everybody, welcome to Mr. and Mrs. Social Studies. My name is Jake, and today's video in our Back to School classroom series is all about seating arrangements and seating charts. Now, I'm not going to lie to you, making seating arrangements and seating charts has always been one of my least favorite parts of back to school season, but it is certainly one of the most important parts. Probably frustrating for me because it is one of the most important parts. You really have to think about it. Seating arrangements, you don't need me to tell you that these literally set the tone of your class. So especially for my first year teachers watching this, if you're about to be entering the start of your educational career, this is definitely something that you don't want to overlook and that you want to think extra long about. Well, maybe just long about, not extra long. You got plenty of other things to do. But you definitely want to take this step seriously in your back to school prep because it can literally be the difference maker between successful lessons in your first few weeks and obviously throughout the whole year, or lessons that maybe don't deliver as well, all simply by where your kids are placed around the room in relationship to you, in relationship to each other, and the kind of environment that it creates. The types of seating charts that you're going to be choosing from is obviously going to somewhat depend on the grade level that you are teaching. For example, if you are teaching kindergartners, you're probably not going to be putting them in rows. I don't know what kind of kindergarten class that would be, other than like a social distance type of situation that a lot of schools have just come out of. Speaking of social distancing, keep in mind when you're thinking about your seating chart choice this year, an element that I know the school I had taught at, I'm sure a lot of other schools this past school year, they're coming off a situation where their seating charts were pretty restrictive in types of formats that they could be using that generally were probably limiting through social distancing student-to-student contact and thus collaboration, group work. So keep that in mind. Students, whether they're saying it or not, they're probably looking forward to something more of a typical school experience where they can be interacting more so with their friends, with their fellow classmates. Something to keep in the back of your mind. If you are at all concerned about your seating chart planning, we do have an editable seating chart template with a variety of different seating chart choices that I'm going to be talking about in a moment here. You can find it in the link down below the video there and use that to your heart's content to help you out here. Okay, so let's talk seating charts. Now, crash course in seating charts here. First one, this is probably the most basic. I just mentioned this a moment ago, rows. Rows get knocked a lot, including by me. I've personally never really been a fan using them on a regular day-to-day basis, but there definitely are some advantages. Probably one of the biggest ones is that rows creates a very formal type of environment. So if you're especially a first-year teacher or a teacher who maybe likes to keep, we don't want to necessarily be like controlling every single facet of our classrooms in terms of feeling like our students, from their perspective, have no choice. But it is a good seating arrangement in terms of that it's not going to probably be one of your loudest and craziest type of environments because your students are literally all facing forward, the same direction, are spaced out from one another. It is sometimes one of the most viable seating arrangements if you have a lot of students that you are trying to fit within your classroom. If you're talking like upwards of 30 kids, the rows are going to really fit into any type of scenario. Rows are also awesome. Not that I like testing, but when you are giving a test and you are trying to monitor and be moving around the room and making sure that all of your kids are where they're supposed to be at, particularly if you're not using something like Google Forms where you have like Chromebooks that make sure that your students can't leave their test when they're not supposed to be leaving their test for other places on the interwebs. It is handy for that kind of a scenario just to kind of eyeball what everybody is supposed to be doing. Cons of this is, well, depends on your perspective, obviously, but a con many teachers would say is that it is teacher-centered and not really student-centered. Reason being is that the focus is all on you. So while this is a particularly great setup, if you are doing lectures, it doesn't really lend itself much to collaboration types of scenarios. But I do have a couple compromises for that in a moment. Also, having used nothing but rows in my most recent year of teaching due to the pandemic, all of our classrooms were set up social distance style. I can definitely say I realized, man, this is definitely hard to maneuver through, particularly if your students have backpacks, if you've got your wonderful students who, for lack of a better term, are a little bit of a hot mess and their stuff is all over the place. If you've got power strips and chargers and things that you're walking through, it's not fun to be going through that. So just some definite logistical things to keep in mind with rows. A compromise to that is pairs. You can still have that row type of setup where everybody is facing forward. It's still a little bit more teacher-centered if you like that, but you also add back in the element of collaboration. You give each of your students a partner, a seat buddy, and you are able to have them work together spontaneously, whether it's like some quick minute exercise, like, hey, what do you think about this particular question I posed? Talk through with your partner, let's talk about it as a whole class. Or if you're having them work on a pairs assignment, then they've got someone right next to them. Or if you decide to randomize them with different people, the desks are still set up for group work there. Con with this, with many of these group type of elements, while they're wonderful, they also will present probably more disruptions than if you're using a straight up row type of setup, because you have given students what many of them love, someone to talk to, which some know how to rein that in and use that productively. Some are going to need a little bit of help with that. You can also be using the, Sarah calls it the airplane setup. And this could be arranged where you have like the pair setup, but you've got it like an airplane. So you've got it in 3 sections. Like if you're on a massive like international flight, you've got the left and like right sections, the wings, where maybe you have 2 or 3 seats going like in rows, and in the middle maybe you've got your 3 or 4 seats. I don't know how big your airplane is, but going in like the middle there, you've got like your 2 aisles, and you can play flight attendant. Well, not really, because you shouldn't be having food and drink in most classrooms, but just another way to kind of have fun with it, vary it up. Kind of goes well also if you have a theme type of classroom, like a travel theme, which we do have also in our store. You could be playing around with that, getting creative there. You can also use what's called a stadium setup, where you have your rows of kids at like an angle, kind of coming in like 2 sides of a triangle. What's great about this setup is that there's great visibility for all students to the teacher, teacher to the students. Varies up the generic row setup that we mentioned earlier. The con with this is that you're going to need to have a big classroom in order to be able to pull this off, because at the farther also you go back, if you're trying to fit in more kids, there's just going to be some spacing challenges that you're going to have if you're trying to use a stadium setup if you've got a smaller space. A couple cons with the stadium setup. Number one, it does fall into the rows and somewhat the pairs in the airplane that I talked about, kind of in that more so teacher-centered, different variations of the row style. Another con of the stadium setup, depending on if you have a lot of kids, you're gonna have inevitably some kids who are gonna be farther in like the back of the room, and that's a con with a lot of the row type of setups, is those kids in the back of the room. They may be less inclined to be engaged in the lesson just because there's more of a physical distance between the action and where they're actually going to be. So something to consider there. Horseshoe. This is a fun one where you kind of have like the 3 sides of a square or a rectangle going on there. And you can even do like a layer. You can have an inner horseshoe. I'm not even drawing this correctly. You can have an inner horseshoe. You can have an outer horseshoe. This is great if you've got a lot of kids that you're trying to cram into your classroom. That sounds bad. If you have a lot of kids, a large class size, trying to fit everybody in there, you've got students all sitting side by side with one another. Kids are a lot more spaced out in the horseshoe setup than they are if you're using some of the other type of setups that are out there. It does take up a little bit more classroom space. But one potential disadvantage of the horseshoe setup is, as are a couple others as we're going to say, is that in some cases kids are going to have to turn their body. I don't know why I'm turning my body. There's no board over there. You maybe have to like turn in order to see the front of the classroom if you're based there, or if you've got your projector, your smart board over there, and that's like the center of where your visual materials is going on. That could potentially be a drawback to that. Also with the horseshoe setup, it's a little bit harder to break up into groups if you're trying to change your seating arrangement temporarily for more group-based activities. That can present a little bit of a challenge as well. One of my personal favorites is the runway, where you have 2 sections, like your students are divided in half, and you've got literally like a runway going down the middle. I personally like this one. I always would use this, I think pretty much every single school year, other than last year with the social distancing. I used this at the start of the year. The reason that I like it, it still has somewhat of that like formal atmosphere, particularly at the start of the school year. If you're doing a lot of like whole type of class discussions, particularly as you're going over like classroom rules, syllabus, you're teaching a lot of procedural stuff as you're getting into your lessons. But it also does leave room for collaboration, the whole group discussion, like I mentioned. Kids can more easily see a larger number of students around the classroom, but everybody isn't all like crammed together in one particular like smaller space of the room. So I particularly liked that element of it. Cons from experience, pairing people off can be a little bit frustrating. You always seem to end up with one awkward situation where you might have to pair two kids from opposite sides of the room if the numbers don't quite line up. That was one thing I always remember happening. Another con of the Runway that I've noticed more so than other setups I've used, by the end of the day, the desks look like a complete disaster because as kids move, the desks move. And whereas in other situations, like groups, when we get into that in a moment, you're not going to notice as much shifting going on. The Runway setup, the desks will kind of be like all crooked at the end of the day. So if you're like me and you can like things to be just so with your seating arrangement, that might bother you. Maybe it won't, I don't know. But I constantly had to do a lot of like readjusting the chairs before I left at the end of the day or before the school day started, only for it to all come undone again. I'm sure I could have did things like tape things down on the floor, or like make tape markings, but some school districts don't like that. So pros and cons with that particular setup. Another obviously popular one is the pods or the clusters or the groups where you put 4, 5, 6 kids, depending on your class size, like together per group. Obviously, this is wonderful because this probably creates the most student-centered group type of atmosphere. This is a wonderful setup to be using if you're like in the middle of a unit or units where there's a lot of collaboration, a lot of teamwork on assignments. If you're doing group projects, obviously a great setup. The con with this, you're probably going to be looking at a lot more disruptions. You're going to be looking at more classroom behavior issues. And when I'm saying this, I'm not saying that classroom management is going to completely fall apart, but just be prepared. You've just given a student 3 or 4 or 5 other people to be talking with all the time. And inevitably, if you're trying to be doing whole class discussion, you're probably going to have more likely some off-task behavior. But again, this is wonderful in particular because you can foster some community in these small groups. You can give students more of a sense of belonging as they get used to being by these classmates for an extended amount of time. And definitely, I think the benefits outweigh the cost. Just be prepared. You're going to have to be doing a little bit more on the classroom management side if you are going to be sticking with this, particularly for an extended period of time. Also, another method which I would definitely not recommend permanently, but you can use the box. It might be just called a square. I don't know. I prefer the box. But this is a great setup. It's where you have your seats all literally in a big square or rectangle. Kind of like if you've ever seen the Hollywood table reads where they're all around like the big table and they're all like reading through the script for the movie or the TV episode that they're going to be doing. So it's great if you've got a reader's theater type of activity. I was also a theater director at my school, so this was a layout that I used for table reads and such. It's also a great setup for whole class debate. You could also do a modified version where you have an inner box and an outer box. I know ELA teachers, English teachers in particular, for Socratic seminars, and also can work with history classrooms too if you want to have a smaller group of kids debating about a certain historical issue. Maybe you're doing like a current events type of discussion. That is a great setup for that. But I definitely wouldn't leave that as your permanent setup because you always are going to have students whose backs are to the front of your room, your smartboard, your whiteboard, where a lot of the action is happening. So for that reason, it probably wouldn't be very handy from a logistical standpoint for a permanent thing. Another setup that you might use as a temporary thing, I call it the Great Hall. You have the several different long like conference tables that you can be using. So if you don't want to have your entire class in one big group discussion, but you want to have maybe 2 or 3 going on with like 8, 9, 10 seats or desks in each one, that is another great alternative. I've used this setup for a couple activities at different points, like preparing for a debate if I had different groups of students who were going to be facing off against each other. But there is a greater risk there. Again, you got to be really on top of your classroom management because when you've got big groups of students broken off with each other, and if they got a time limit to try to get something done, sometimes there might be some issues that could arise. Again, I'm not saying not to use it. It's also a wonderful setup, as well as just general pods for like a jigsaw type of activity or a stations type of activity. But I probably personally wouldn't keep my class there in a permanent setup. So those are all the different seating arrangements. So have fun trying to figure out what you're doing with that. Again, I know personally me, I kind of stuck with the Runway was one I used a lot. The pods were one I used a lot. Rows and variations of it, sometimes by necessity, I've used a lot. So some of these setups are going to be great more so for permanent ones, and some of these are more so going to be great for like temporary, lesson specific activities that you're going to use. A couple other things to think about after you do the seating arrangement, just a few tips on the seating chart, actual element of it where you actually have to place your students into their specific spots. You obviously are going into your first seating chart every year with very limited, if any, information about your students. So you're obviously going to make mistakes that you could never have anticipated. I know I was guilty of that every single year, put my hand up for that. Some first year teachers might be going in and asking, do I even need a seating chart? Is it worth my time? Can't I just trust the kids to sit where they want and show that I'm a cool, fun, respectful teacher because I give that choice to the kids? And I would say no to that, at least initially. I would say going in with a seating chart. And first and foremost, it's because as a first year teacher, I know that you've student taught. I know that you have some idea as to what you were like as a teacher. But at least in my opinion, you never really fully know until you have your own classroom and you are the teacher. You are the person who is large and in charge, so to speak. And you're going to probably, it's safer to have a little bit more control, I would say, at the beginning. And then as you learn more about yourself and your teaching style, as you learn more about your kids, you can gradually loosen up and you could give that choice to the students later on. Okay, I'm not saying never give that choice, but at least at the beginning, I'd say it's better to have some structure. And I'll also go into more reasons for that in a bit here too. A compromise to this, because then going into the seating chart part, there's different ways you could do this. And Sarah and I actually, we have different opinions on this. So I'm going to share both of them because they both definitely have their value. So Sarah's opinion on this, she would have the conversation with them the first day of school. Hey, I am going to be observing you for the first week as far as your behavior, as far as your choices in class, when you are in a seating arrangement of your choice. And if you show me in this first week that you can handle that responsibility, then when I place you in the seating chart, I'm not opposed to putting you by your friends because you've already demonstrated that you can handle that. But if you cannot show me that you can handle that responsibility at this time, then you sure as heck can expect that I am not going to be putting you by your friends for the foreseeable future. And that is going to be shown in the seating chart that I'm going to create. So that was Sarah's approach. My philosophy was always having a seating chart ready to go for every single one of my classes the first week of school. And there were a couple reasons behind my choice for this. Number one, I did not want to make anybody nervous that first week or that first day of wondering where the heck am I going to sit. Because you do run into the situation when kids come in and they make their choice about where they're going to sit. They're going to be like, hey, like friends, come over here. Hey, this seat's taken. Sorry, please go somewhere else. And I never wanted to make a student feel that way. Also because I identify with that kind of student when I was in school of not having like the friends to be sitting by and so to speak. So choose the way that makes the most sense to you. There's no right or wrong. It really just kind of depends on your perspective and where you're coming from with it. Now, when you're actually placing your students, again, there's very limited information that you're going to be having when you're making your first seating chart, so it's not going to be as informed as the ones that you're going to make later on when you know your kids, which is an advantage of going Sarah's route and waiting to make it versus the route I suggested of having it all set forward at the beginning. But of course, I would make arrangements and changes later if I needed to, but depends on your viewpoint. So when you're actually setting this up, you should know going in at the very least who your students are who have IEPs or 504s or other special accommodations that need to be taken into consideration. Almost always there is going to be some type of accommodation that has to do with where these students are going to be sitting. So my advice would be identify those kids on your class roster first, get them placed in the prime real estate, either probably like the front of the classroom or maybe a group that's closer in proximity to you. One thing that people don't always consider when making their seating chart is if you have an instructional aide and you are aware of this, where are they going to be sitting? If you've got kids, particularly with IEPs, who you know are going to be receiving some extra support and extra accommodations from another adult in the classroom, or if you have a co-teacher in the classroom, then I always tried to group those students in close proximity to each other, in close proximity to where that I thought that the instructional aid was going to be based out of. And this became a little easier for me because I was paired with the same person over multiple years, and we kind of developed our system on this. But that might be something that you want to consider. So even having those kids paired in like relatively the same pod or 2 pods around each other, if you're in rows, having them generally in the same like 2 or 3 rows, like section in the class. Maybe you've got kids who more so their thing is that they need to stand up and that they need to move a little bit. Maybe you have them in the back of the class on an end closer to the door if they're going to need to make an exit at some point in the class. So that's going to be less disruptive for everybody else. Again, the more experience that you get, you're going to pick up on this stuff more intuitively as you go along. After you've placed your 504 and IEP students, this is going to come more into play later, but who are your students who've identified themselves as needing some extra supports? Whether students that you've learned, hey, like their vision is not the greatest and they need to be closer to the board. Whether you've got students who maybe are a little bit behaviorally challenged and you kind of got to read on what their needs are, and you can place them in a spot accordingly to help benefit them and help benefit also the progress going on in the rest of the class. Again, these things will more so reveal themselves after you make that first seating chart, and then you can make those adjustments. Other strategies, if you're trying to make a seating chart at the beginning but you don't have a lot of information to go off of, you could go the random generator route if you're using PowerSchool or Skyward. You also could go the route, I never like to just straight up alphabetize, go in alphabetical order with my kids, like all my A's with the last name A's, all with the last name B's. So you could go alphabetical by first name, change it up a little bit if you're trying to go for a quick fix. Or you could potentially do alphabetical by first name, but do it in more so like a zigzag. So I like to think that then the students weren't onto my tricks, that I was trying to make a seating chart with a little bit less effort. Again, there's a lot of different ways that you can approach it, particularly with that first one. And then you can make some more informed decisions as you go along later on. And also think about where your desk is going to be with the seating chart, because that's important too. You really want to keep your space with your desk. You want to be like in proximity, but you don't want to be right up along students because they're not going to like that. You're not going to like that if you're sitting at your desk at a portion where they're doing their independent work. I don't know, just something I always like to think about. But your desk also is a lot harder to move. So with that, that's another consideration to think. So that is my very long and extended spiel on seating charts and seating arrangements. So go forth and use the information to your heart's content. Again, if you're still feeling a little bit overwhelmed because I talked for a really long time about this stuff, there is a link in the description below with the different seating charts that I mentioned that you can use to help you create yours for the school year. Remember that we are continuing this back to school extravaganza teacher series, which is there for first year teachers, which is there for any sort of teachers if you need a refresher. So if you liked what you saw in this video and you can't get enough of Mr. and Mrs. Social Studies, I don't blame you, then please like and please subscribe. That way you don't hurt my feelings and that way I don't cry. Tear. Wanted to show you what I was capable of. There are other videos that you can watch in the series too. There is one that is over here. There is one that is over here. So go watch them, have fun, and happy seating chart making. Bye.